Yeah, my name is Marshall Irwin. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Fastly. I'm going to talk about how we're making the internet a better place through our support for open source, and particularly how that allows us to build more secure products. Open source makes the internet a better place first by driving innovation. That's primarily what it does, and was really the original motivation, I think, for the open source movement. But it also makes the internet a better place by allowing us to identify flaws in code and fix them much more quickly. The fact is, we all know that we're constantly in a process of writing new code, introducing new vulnerabilities, and then finding and removing those vulnerabilities. So there's never going to be code that's like perfect and doesn't have any security vulnerabilities. But I think open source, we've learned it's superior because what it does is it crowdsources the finding of those vulnerabilities and allows us to fix them more quickly. And so that, for this sort of fundamental reason, I think open source you can have more confidence in than closed source. There's also a secondary important benefit to open source code, which is that it allows consumers to inspect that code and make sure that it is operating as intended. You don't have to trust a company to say, this is what my product does, but the code isn't available, and you can't really have confidence. So open sourcing the code, not only does it allow us to find security vulnerabilities, but it also just allows the public to inspect that code and confirm for themselves that the product is doing what a company says it is doing. And that's an important element of the trust model with open source code as well. Yeah, I think the challenge that we've seen more recently is one related to sort of ownership and maintenance of open source code. So there have been two interesting incidents in recent years. One you'll hear referred to as sort of Log4j, where we saw a piece of open source code that's used very widely had a major vulnerability in it, and raises questions about how we make sure that open source code receives the right level of security diligence and that it isn't just orphaned. A second incident we saw just this year is one where, again, another really important open source tool, which was being maintained publicly, and an attacker actually somehow sort of infiltrated the group maintaining that code and inserted a backdoor in that code. So what both of these examples show us is that we don't want open source code to be orphaned such that it isn't maintained and it doesn't receive the appropriate level of security diligence by someone who clearly owns that code and takes responsibility for it. And this is, I think, a newer development. You know, open source has been around now for 30 years, and we see some of this open source code being used very widely. It's copied, it's used everywhere, but then you got to ask, is it maintained enough such that I should have confidence in it? And that's the shortcoming that I think we're starting to learn a little bit more about and thinking how we should solve. If you are using open source code, you should know the provenance of that code. You should know when it has gone through its recent security diligence. One of the challenges I think right now is people don't always know where their code is coming from, what they're using, and the level of security diligence that has been applied to it. And so it's a basic requirement that people are looking at right now is to say, how can we have confidence that we know what has gone into our products, what open source tools we are using? And that's, I think, a first step and an important step. You know, the way that I think CISOs should look at AI-generated code is exactly the same way as they should look at human-generated code, which is it's going to have flaws, and we need to find those flaws. You know, we know, again, that humans write code all the time, and we're not perfect, and we're going to make mistakes. But if you've followed the debate about AI over the last few years, you also know they make plenty of mistakes too. What AI-generated code is going to do, it might generate code that can be used, but it doesn't mean that it's going to generate code that doesn't have vulnerabilities, again, just like humans. And so we need to ensure that AI-generated code goes through the same process as the code we're already writing using human processes. And if we do that, then I think we're going to be okay. If we assume that AI-generated code is going to be perfect and it doesn't need to be inspected, it doesn't need to go through some security diligence, then we're actually all going to be worse off. And the products we build are going to be less secure than they would be otherwise.